Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer, thanks to Spiteful AZ for this one. Amy taps 5 lands and says, I'm going to play Rot-Tide Gargantua, exploiting my grizzly bears. Nick says, hold on a minute, I want to kill the grizzly bears in response. At this point, the players disagree about what happens, so they call for a judge. What do you do? Okay, so this is a really interesting call, and it's something that happens quite a lot as a judge. The issue here is that players routinely take lots of shortcuts throughout every game of Magic that they play. And a lot of the time, as a judge, determining the correct infraction relies heavily on knowing exactly what's technically happened in the game, which is something that the players may or may not have communicated clearly to each other, or may not have the rules knowledge necessary to define themselves. So in cases like this, what I like to do is use as a starting point, what did each player try to do? And try to identify if there's anything that's against the rules with something that they tried to do. So with Amy, it's pretty straightforward to see what she tried to do here, right? She tried to play a Rot-Tide Gargantua and exploit her grizzly bears. Now, nothing in that sequence is against the rules. That's definitely a sequence of plays that she could legally take. Now let's take a look at Nick. And if you watched my video yesterday, you might be thinking that maybe he tried to do something that's against the rules. If you missed it, the punchline was that it's not possible for you to respond to someone sacrificing a creature with Catapult Captain by killing the creature or otherwise affecting its toughness. And the reason for that is because you do not have priority any time between when the player is activating the ability of Catapult Captain and when the creature actually gets sacrificed. Now, in this case, we're actually different in a couple of key ways, and the reason for that is how exploit functions. Exploit is a triggered ability that triggers when the creature that has exploit enters the battlefield. And so you can see that there's actually 2 different times that a player would be able to have priority to cast spells and activate abilities in between when a player plays an exploit creature and when the exploiting actually happens. So you could respond to the exploit creature itself, or you could respond to the triggered ability of exploit as it enters the battlefield. Now, it is true that at neither of those points would Nick actually know the identity of the creature that Amy is planning on sacrificing. However, in this case, Amy actually volunteered this information herself. Nick didn't solicit it, and Nick didn't have any way to stop Amy from saying that she was planning on exploiting grizzly bears after he got the information that she was playing an exploit creature. So with this, I would say that neither player has done anything against the rules, but the fact that they've gone through the game at different paces has led to an issue. As a judge, I would rule that Nick does have the opportunity to respond to either the exploit creature or the exploit ability as he sees fit. Now, there is something in the game with the shortcut policy that says that a player can propose a shortcut and expect that each player is going to do nothing and let it go through to completion. So in this case, it's definitely within Amy's rights to suggest, I'm going to play this exploit creature, exploit this creature of mine, and we'll proceed through the game with no other priority passes. Now, you of course cannot use this mechanism to deny an opponent the opportunity to respond at the appropriate time. I touched on this a little bit in last week's episode about out-of-order sequencing, and I went into a lot more detail in my episode that I did a while ago where I talked about loops and shortcuts. I'd suggest that anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about how exactly that works, check out either of those videos to see a little bit more detail. For now, it's sufficient for us to just know that it is legal and acceptable for Amy to suggest this shortcut, and it is possible for Nick to interrupt that shortcut at a time that suits him. So now what do we do? Well, if we're going to assume that Amy has suggested a shortcut where she plays an exploit creature and then everybody passes priority until the exploit ability is resolving, then it would make sense for us to interrupt that shortcut at the point where Nick says. Now, Nick did not say whether he was planning on casting his removal spell in response to the exploit creature spell or in response to the exploit ability on the stack. However, that would be something that Nick would have the opportunity to say now. A lot of the time when players do stuff like this, they aren't going to be exactly precise about when they're doing it. However, as long as you're a judge there and taking the call, I think it's best that the players go through things exactly in precise order and exactly at the official time for everything. That way, it's going to be a lot easier to solve any problems that might come up along the way. So I would ask Nick whether he intends to play his removal spell in response to the exploit trigger or in response to the exploit creature. And of course, either of those answers would be acceptable. After that point, the game would continue as normal. Now, Amy, even though she proposed a shortcut, is not going to be held to any of the stuff that she said after the point where Nick intervened. And that's fair, right? I mean, Amy didn't know anything that Nick was going to do when she was saying her shortcut, so if Nick is allowed to cut in and change what is going to happen in the game, then it would make sense for Amy to have also the opportunity to change her plans in response to the sort of stuff that Nick is going to be doing. So, with that said, when would be the best time for Nick to cast his removal spell? So, as far as strategy is concerned, I'm not really sure if there's a difference between Nick playing his removal spell in response to the exploit creature or the exploit trigger. However, I think that there might be a way for him to get a little bit more value, assuming that his removal spell is able to do it. If Nick has a removal spell that's capable of killing the Rot-Tide Gargantua, that's probably what he wants to target. To see why this is, recall that if you play an exploit creature and have it exploit itself, you would indeed get the trigger effect from that one. So for example, if Amy used Rot-Tide Gargantua and exploited itself, Nick would have to sacrifice a creature. This is because exploit triggers count as leaves the battlefield triggers, and that means that they look at the game state immediately before when the trigger event happened to see if they should trigger or whether they existed. Immediately before Amy sacrificed the Rot-Tide Gargantua, then she did in fact have an ability on the field that said when you exploit a creature, then your opponent has to sacrifice. However, if Nick was to play a creature removal spell on the Rot-Tide Gargantua in response to the exploit ability, well then immediately before Amy exploited a creature, then there wouldn't be any creature on the battlefield which had an ability that said something like when you exploit a creature this way. Therefore, it would make sense for Nick to play that removal spell against the Rot-Tide Gargantua rather than the Grizzly Bears, so that way he would not have to sacrifice a creature even if Amy did exploit something. It still would be legal for Amy to exploit something, even though the creature that gives her a benefit from exploiting is no longer on the battlefield anymore. However, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for her to do that. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.